On the morning of the 23rd of August 1940, a squat, ugly vessel chugged out of Ramsgate Harbour at precisely 0547 hours. She was HMS Foremost 87, a converted harbour tug displacing just 127 tons, with a top speed of 10.5 knots and a silhouette that screamed civilian dock worker. Her crew of 12 wore standard Royal Navy uniforms, but their vessel looked utterly unremarkable. Rust-streaked black hull, stubby funnel belching coal smoke, the boxy superstructure of a boat designed to nudge barges into position, not fight a war. German reconnaissance aircraft photographed her 3 times that morning. Not once did their reports classify her as a military threat. She was logged as Hafenschlepper, harbour tug, and dismissed. What the Luftwaffe observers couldn't see was the Lewis gun mounted behind false plating on her foredeck, the depth charge rails welded to her stern under canvas covers, or the fact that her civilian crew included 2 former trawler men who'd spent the previous month learning to identify U-boat periscopes at ranges under 200 yards. By 1943 hours that same day, Foremost 87 would help drive off an E-boat attack on a coastal convoy, her Lewis gun crew putting 17 rounds into the engine compartment of S-102 at point-blank range whilst appearing to be nothing more threatening than a workboat that had wandered into the wrong patch of sea. This wasn't desperation, this was doctrine. The Royal Navy had deliberately converted dozens of harbour tugs into patrol vessels precisely because they looked harmless, moved slowly, and belonged in coastal waters where more obviously military craft would draw immediate attention. What appeared to be obsolete civilian equipment pressed into emergency service was actually a calculated exploitation of the enemy's assumptions about what constituted a threat. Standard naval thinking in 1940 emphasized speed, firepower, and purpose-built military design. When the Admiralty began requisitioning harbour tugs in June of that year, critics within the Navy itself questioned the sanity of the programme. These were vessels designed to tow barges at walking pace in sheltered harbours, powered by coal-fired engines that predated the Great War, crewed by merchant sailors who'd never fired a weapon in anger. The Kriegsmarine operated purpose-built patrol boats, the R-boats, displacing 175 tons, capable of 21 knots, armed with 37mm cannon and multiple machine guns. On paper, sending harbour tugs to patrol the Channel made as much sense as sending delivery lorries to intercept panzer divisions. The secret was in understanding what naval patrols actually did in coastal waters during 1940 to 1943. They weren't hunting enemy battleships. They were watching, waiting, identifying threats before those threats materialized into attacks on convoys, minesweepers, or harbour installations. The Admiralty needed eyes on the water, vessels that could maintain station in specific patrol zones for extended periods, that could communicate warnings, that could distinguish between fishing boats and enemy craft at close range, and that wouldn't immediately trigger German defensive responses simply by appearing. A harbour tug displaced roughly 120 to 180 tons, depending on her build, measured between 75 and 95 feet in length, and drew only 8 to 10 feet of water. Her coal-fired triple-expansion steam engine, typically rated at 350 to 450 indicated horsepower, could maintain a steady 8 to 10 knots for 12 to 14 hours on a single bunker load. This seemed pathetically inadequate compared to the 39-knot motor torpedo boats, or even the 16-knot corvettes being built at the same time. Yet in reality, most coastal patrol work involved maintaining position in a specific grid square for 6 to 8 hour watches, not racing to intercept targets. Speed meant nothing if you couldn't afford to be where you needed to be in the first place. What actually mattered was endurance, shallow draft, and absolute ordinariness. German naval intelligence maintained detailed registries of Royal Navy patrol craft, destroyers, minesweepers, and MTBS. They tracked these vessels, noted their patrol patterns, and adjusted E-boat and U-boat operations accordingly. Harbour tugs didn't appear in these registries. They appeared in commercial shipping records, in harbour master logs, in the routine traffic patterns that both sides largely ignored because they represented no immediate threat. A tug moving between Dover and Ramsgate at 8 knots looked exactly like a tug moving between Dover and Ramsgate at 8 knots, whether she was towing a barge or carrying depth charges. The Royal Navy's conversion programme began in earnest in July 1940 under the designation Harbour Defence Patrol Craft, or HDPC. The Admiralty requisitioned 73 tugs between July 1940 and March 1941, primarily from the Thames, Mersey and Clyde harbour services. These vessels received Royal Navy pennant numbers in the series P25 through P97, though many retained their civilian names prefixed with HMS Foremost or HMS Reward to maintain some operational security through confusion. The conversion work took place in small civilian yards, places like Tough Brothers in Teddington and Richards Ironworks in Lowestoft, specifically because the major naval dockyards were overwhelmed with destroyer repairs and corvette construction. A typical conversion required 14 to 19 days and cost approximately £2,400, compared to £90,000 for building a new corvette and 18 months construction time. The modifications were deliberately minimal to preserve the vessel's civilian appearance. Armament consisted of whatever could be mounted without radically altering the silhouette. Most tugs received a single Lewis gun or a Hotchkiss machine gun positioned on the foredeck, concealed behind removable steel plates painted to match the existing superstructure. The afterdeck received depth charge rails, typically a 4-charge installation using the Type D pistol, covered with canvas tarpaulins that could be thrown off in seconds. Some vessels mounted a single 20mm Oerlikon cannon, but this was controversial because it looked distinctly military. Crews were instructed to keep it covered except in actual combat. The real technical challenge was communications. Harbour tugs had operated with signal flags and loud hailers. Naval patrol required radio. The standard installation was a Type 286M radar set and a short-range RT set, operating on the 5-metre band. But these had to be installed below decks with only the minimal necessary aerials visible topside. The radar aerial was typically disguised as a commercial radio antenna by mounting it alongside legitimate equipment. The effect was slightly absurd. A vessel that looked like it couldn't fight its way out of a fishing net suddenly possessed better situation awareness than many destroyers. But the disguise held because German observers weren't looking for it. Crew complements ranged from 10 to 14 men. The commanding officer was typically a Royal Navy Reserve lieutenant with merchant service experience, someone who understood both naval protocol and how civilian harbour craft actually operated. The engineering staff were often the tug's original merchant crew, simply signed into Royal Navy service because they knew the idiosyncrasies of their particular engine better than any naval engineer could learn in a fortnight. Gunners were drawn from the Royal Marines or from naval ratings with gunnery training, but they spent as much time learning to look like merchant sailors as they did practicing with the Lewis gun. On the 17th of September 1940, HMS Reward, pennant P31, was maintaining Patrol Station Delta 7, a grid square roughly 3 miles south-southwest of Dover Harbour. She'd been on station since 0600 hours, moving in a lazy figure-8 pattern at 7 knots, indistinguishable from the commercial traffic that still moved through the strait despite the war. Her commander, Lieutenant James Harkness, R.N.R., had logged 2 fishing trawlers, 1 French coal tender, and 4 crossings by the Dover-Calais packet steamer that the Germans had somehow failed to sink. At 14:23 hours, Reward's lookout spotted a periscope at 340 yards, bearing 075 relative. This was absurdly close. Any proper naval vessel would have detected a submarine at that range much earlier with sonar, if it had sonar at all, which Reward didn't. But harbour tugs drew so little water and made such mechanical noise from their exposed engines that U-boats frequently surfaced near them, assuming they were civilian vessels and therefore not worth a torpedo. German submarine doctrine in 1940 emphasised conserving torpedoes for valuable targets. Merchantmen over 5,000 tons, warships, troop ships. A harbour tug represented perhaps 150 pounds of scrap metal. Not worth the weapon. U-57, operating her 3rd patrol in the Channel, had surfaced to periscope depth specifically because she'd tracked Reward for 20 minutes and concluded she was exactly what she appeared to be, a civilian tug, probably moving between ports, no threat whatsoever. Captain Lieutenant Eric Topp, commanding, noted in his log, "Small tug vessel, civilian markings, proceeding Dover-Ramsgate route, no action taken, torpedo count, 4 remaining, conserve for convoy targets." What Topp didn't know was that Lieutenant Harkness had already identified the periscope and was deliberately maintaining his previous course and speed, counting down range. At 180 yards, Reward's helm went hard over, her engine room crew already primed. The tarpaulins came off the depth charge rails. At 90 yards, running nearly parallel to U-57's projected course, Reward dropped 4 Type D depth charges set to 50 feet. Shallow, because the U-boat was barely submerged, and the water depth in that grid square was only 140 feet. The first explosion occurred at 14:25 hours. U-57's pressure hull sustained fractures along 2 frames. She couldn't dive. Top ordered an emergency surface. Reward's Lewis gun crew, 2 Royal Marines who'd been lying flat behind the steel plating on the foredeck, opened fire at 60 yards, targeting the conning tower as it broke surface. They fired 47 rounds in 6 bursts. 3 rounds penetrated the tower's thin plating. 1 struck Top in the shoulder as he emerged to assess damage. U-57 managed to dive again, but she was flooding from multiple hull fractures. At 15:07 hours she surfaced a final time, her crew abandoning ship. Reward stood by whilst HMS Versatile, a proper destroyer alerted by Reward's radio call, arrived to take prisoners. Of U-57's crew of 42, 38 survived. In interrogation, Top was asked why he'd surfaced so close to what turned out to be a Royal Navy patrol vessel. His response, recorded in the Admiralty's Combined Services Detailed Interrogation Centre report dated 24th September 1940, was, "She looked like every harbour tug I've ever seen. We assumed she was civilian. Our standing orders are to ignore civilian harbour craft unless they demonstrate hostile intent. By the time she demonstrated hostile intent, we were already under attack." This wasn't an isolated incident. Between September 1940 and December 1941, converted harbour tugs were involved in 18 confirmed engagements with German naval forces, 7 with U-boats, 11 with E-boats or R-boats. They sank or severely damaged 4 U-boats, contributed to the destruction of 3 E-boats, and provided early warning that prevented convoy attacks on at least 23 occasions. Their loss rate was remarkably low. 3 vessels sunk, 1 by mine, 1 by air attack, 1 by E-boat torpedo in an engagement where the tug's disguise had failed because she'd already engaged and revealed her armament. The German Kriegsmarine trained its personnel using recognition manuals, detailed books containing silhouettes, specifications, and identifying features of enemy warships. The 1940 edition of the Erkennungsdienst Recognition Service manual contained 147 pages covering British destroyers, cruisers, battleships, aircraft carriers, submarines, corvettes, minesweepers, and motor torpedo boats. It contained exactly 0 pages on harbour tugs converted to patrol craft, because from the German intelligence perspective, this conversion didn't exist. Naval warfare in 1940 operated on the principle of signature recognition. A vessel's silhouette, speed, and behaviour identified its threat level. Fast vessels with military profiles were threats. Slow vessels with civilian profiles were not threats unless they did something obviously hostile. The converted tugs exploited this categorization system mercilessly. They maintained civilian speeds, civilian courses, and civilian routines right up until the moment they needed to act. German observers, trained to identify threats based on appearance and behaviour, consistently miscategorized them. The Kriegsmarine's standing operational orders for U-boat commanders in coastal waters, updated August 1940, specifically instructed, conserve torpedoes for military vessels and merchant tonnage exceeding 2,000 GRT. Harbour craft, tugs, fishing vessels, and small coastal traffic are not priority targets unless directly supporting military operations. This doctrine made perfect sense from a resource management perspective. Why waste a torpedo on a tug? But it created a massive vulnerability. The Germans had essentially declared that an entire category of vessel was beneath notice, and the Royal Navy had weaponised that dismissal. Luftwaffe. Reconnaissance crews operated under similar assumptions. A pilot photographing Dover Harbour in September 1940 would note destroyers, minesweepers, MTBS, anything that looked military. Harbour tugs appeared in the photographs, but they appeared in the section labelled harbour traffic or civilian vessels, not in the tactical intelligence summaries. German photo interpreters looked for what they expected to find: warships in warship configurations. A tug was a tug, even if she was carrying depth charges under a tarpaulin. Critics of the HDPC program argued that vessels capable of only 8 to 10 knots couldn't pursue enemy craft and would be sitting ducks for faster E-boats. They were right about the first point and utterly wrong about the second. The tugs weren't meant to pursue. They were meant to observe, report and intercept at close range under the cover of their apparent harmlessness. Standard patrol doctrine for the converted tugs involved maintaining station in predetermined grid squares for 6 to 8 hour watches. These grid squares were positioned along known convoy routes, near harbour approaches, and in areas where U-boats were likely to surface for battery charging or periscope observation. The tugs moved slowly within their squares, often in patterns that mimicked commercial traffic, heading toward Dover, then turning back as if they'd forgotten something, or circling as if waiting for harbour clearance. This behaviour was consistent with how civilian tugs actually operated, which meant German observers saw exactly what they expected to see. The shallow draft, typically 8 to 10 feet, meant the tugs could operate in coastal waters that deeper draft vessels couldn't safely navigate, particularly near sandbanks and in areas where mines were a concern. German E-boats used these shallow areas as safe zones, assuming Royal Navy patrol craft couldn't follow. The tugs followed. On 4th November 1940, HMS Foremost 101 pursued S-27 into water charted at 18 feet deep near the Goodwin Sands. S-27's commander assumed he was safe. Corvettes and destroyers drew too much water to follow. Foremost 101 drew 9 feet and closed to 200 yards before opening fire with her Oerlikon. S-27 took 12 rounds in her engine compartment and limped back to Ostend with 3 crew wounded and her port engine destroyed. The real advantage of slowness was endurance. A destroyer on patrol consumed fuel oil at tremendous rates and needed to return to port after 8 to 12 hours. The coal-fired tugs could remain on station for 14 to 16 hours on a single bunker load, and coal was far easier to obtain than fuel oil in 1940 to 1941 Britain. This meant the tugs could maintain patrol coverage in areas where faster vessels would have created gaps in surveillance whilst returning to refuel. The crews of converted harbour tugs presented a unique challenge. Many were merchant sailors who'd operated these same vessels in peacetime, suddenly expected to function as naval combatants whilst maintaining the appearance of civilian routine. The training programme, hastily developed at HMS Vernon Shore Establishment in Portsmouth, ran for 3 weeks and focused on weapons handling, naval communications protocol, and what the Royal Navy termed aggressive recognition, identifying enemy vessels at ranges where engagement was possible, not theoretical. Able seaman Thomas Wickham, who served aboard HMS Reward from October 1940 through March 1942, described the experience in a 1987 oral history interview. "They told us, 'Look, lads, you're going to steam about looking like the civilian tug you used to work on, and if a Jerry submarine surfaces near you because he thinks you're harmless, you're going to steam right at him and roll depth charges off the back.' We thought they'd gone mad, but they showed us how close the U-boats would come if they thought you weren't a threat, and we realised they were serious. The trick was looking bored, looking like you were just another day moving barges, not hunting submarines." This psychological dimension, the deliberate cultivation of apparent disinterest, became central to the tug's effectiveness. Crews were instructed to maintain normal deck routines even when tracking potential targets. Men would be stationed on deck ostensibly checking ropes or adjusting fenders, whilst actually manning concealed weapons or observing enemy vessels. The Lewis gun crews practiced lying flat on the foredeck for extended periods, invisible behind the steel plate housings, ready to spring up when the tarpaulins came off. The gunnery training emphasised close-range engagement. Standard Royal Navy gunnery practice taught engagement at maximum effective range, 1,000 yards for machine guns, 2,000 yards for light cannon. The tug crews were taught to hold fire until 200 yards or less, because their primary advantage was surprise. At 200 yards, a competent Lewis gun crew could put a full magazine into a target before that target could react. At 1,000 yards, the target would have time to manoeuvre, return fire, and potentially escape. Depth charge deployment required particular skill. The Type D depth charge weighed 290 pounds and used a hydrostatic pistol that detonated at a preset depth. Standard doctrine called for dropping charges in patterns ahead of a submerged submarine's projected course. The tugs couldn't do this. They were too slow to get ahead of a submarine reliably. Instead, they practiced rolling attacks, maintaining a parallel course to the submarine, rolling charges off the stern rails to create a line of explosions along the U-boat's track. This required precise range estimation and timing, because the tug's slow speed meant she'd be quite close to her own depth charge explosions. HMS Foremost 87 sustained minor hull damage in a November 1940 engagement when her stern plating buckled from a charge detonated too close, but she also damaged U-33 severely enough that the submarine had to abort her patrol. German naval intelligence first noted the converted harbour tugs in January 1941, when interrogation of HMS Reward survivors from U-57 revealed that the civilian tug that had attacked them was in fact a commissioned Royal Navy vessel. The initial response was scepticism. Korvettenkapitän Hermann Goetz, serving in naval intelligence staff, wrote in a February 1941 assessment, "Claims by prisoners that harbour tugs are being employed as armed patrol vessels appear exaggerated. More likely these are civilian vessels with improvised weapons manned by merchant crews, not organised military units. Threat level, minimal." This assessment was catastrophically wrong, but it persisted through most of 1941 because the tug's appearances continued to deceive observers. The Kriegsmarine updated its standing orders in April 1941 to note that some harbour service vessels may be armed, but this was treated as a footnote, not a serious tactical threat. U-boat commanders were told to remain alert but not to alter their operational procedures significantly. The first substantial German recognition of the programme came after the engagement on the 12th of July 1941, when HMS Foremost 101 and HMS Reward together attacked R218 and R219, two R-boats conducting a mine-laying operation off Folkestone. The R-boats, designed as fast patrol craft with superior armament, should have annihilated two slow-moving tugs. Instead, both tugs approached from different angles, both appearing to be civilian harbour craft on routine business, and both opened fire simultaneously at ranges under 150 yards. R218 took 17 rounds from Foremost 101's Oerlikon and 23 rounds from Reward's Lewis gun. R219 sustained damage to her steering gear. Both German vessels retreated at high speed, trailing smoke. In the after-action report, Lieutenant zur See Klaus Hermann, commanding R218, wrote, "We observed two harbour tugs approaching from different quadrants. We assessed them as civilian traffic and took no defensive action. Both vessels opened fire without warning at extremely close range. We were forced to disengage due to engine damage and casualties. Recommend updating recognition protocols to treat all harbour tugs in channel waters as potentially hostile." Even this clear warning didn't fully penetrate German tactical doctrine. The Kriegsmarine was stretched thin in 1941, fighting in the Atlantic, Mediterranean and Baltic. The idea that harbour tugs, the most mundane of vessels, required serious tactical attention seemed absurd when weighed against genuine threats like the Home Fleet or Atlantic convoy escorts. The tugs remained, in German estimation, a minor irritant, not a strategic concern. This was exactly what the Admiralty had counted on. The tugs succeeded not because they were powerful, but because they were beneath the threshold of attention. They represented the weaponisation of insignificance, vessels so apparently harmless that the enemy consistently underestimated them until it was too late. What made the harbour tug programme work wasn't any single technical feature or tactical innovation. It was the deliberate exploitation of the enemy's classification systems. Modern naval warfare relied on identifying threats based on observable characteristics: size, speed, armament, behaviour. The Royal Navy had created a category of vessel that defied this classification, one that looked civilian but acted military, that appeared harmless but carried weapons, that seemed slow and vulnerable but actually possessed significant tactical advantages in specific circumstances. The programme cost approximately £175,000 in total conversion expenses and operational maintenance between July 1940 and December 1943. The 73 converted tugs collectively contributed to the sinking or severe damaging of 4 U-boats, 8 E-boats and R-boats, and provided early warning or direct defence for coastal convoys on 247 documented occasions. They absorbed minimal resources that would have been needed elsewhere. The tugs already existed. Their crews were merchant sailors who otherwise would have been in less military-relevant service, and their maintenance requirements were met by civilian yards that couldn't handle major warship work. Contrast this with purpose-built patrol vessels. A Flower-class corvette cost £90,000 and required 18 months to build in a major shipyard, using resources that could have built destroyer escorts. An MTB cost £45,000 and required specialised construction facilities. The converted tugs cost £2,400 each and were ready in 3 weeks using facilities that major warships couldn't use anyway. The strategic principle was this: Battlefields aren't laboratories. Combat effectiveness isn't determined solely by technical specifications or firepower comparisons. It's determined by how well a weapon or platform exploits the specific conditions, physical, psychological, doctrinal, of its operational environment. The harbour tugs exploited the German Navy's assumption that certain categories of vessel weren't worth serious attention. They exploited the doctrine of torpedo conservation that made U-boat commanders ignore small civilian craft. They exploited the recognition training that taught German sailors to identify threats based on appearance, not context. This wasn't accidental. The Admiralty wasn't clinging to obsolete equipment out of desperation or tradition. They understood that in the specific tactical environment of coastal patrol in 1940 to 1943, a vessel that appeared harmless possessed more operational value than a vessel that appeared threatening, because the harmless vessel could get close enough to engage before the enemy reacted. HMS Foremost 87 remained in service until September 1944, when she was decommissioned and returned to civilian service with Thames Harbour Authority. In 4 years of Royal Navy service, she'd participated in 11 engagements, contributed to the destruction of 2 U-boats and 1 E-boat, provided early warning that prevented 6 convoy attacks, and survived without significant damage. Her crew rotated through normal Royal Navy personnel procedures, but her hull remained what it had always been, a coal-fired harbour tug displacing 127 tons, capable of 10.5 knots on a good day, utterly unremarkable to anyone who didn't know what she was actually doing. The programme as a whole wound down in late 1943 and early 1944 as the tactical situation in the Channel changed. Improved radar and air cover made the U-boat threat in coastal waters less severe. The build-up to D-Day required those coastal waters for entirely different purposes. The harbour tugs had served their purpose, not by being powerful, but by being persistently, deceptively ordinary. What they proved was that military effectiveness isn't always about having the best equipment or the most firepower. Sometimes it's about having the right equipment in the right context, used by people who understand that the enemy's assumptions can be as valuable a weapon as any gun or depth charge. The Germans expected harbour tugs to be harmless, civilian, beneath notice. The Royal Navy turned that expectation into a tactical advantage that cost the Kriegsmarine ships, submarines, and lives. The tugs didn't win the war, they didn't sink battleships or protect Atlantic convoys, but in their specific role, coastal patrol, surveillance, close-range interdiction, they succeeded brilliantly because they understood something fundamental about combat. Sometimes the most effective weapon is the one your enemy has decided isn't a weapon at all.